And then finally, now we've heard a lot of the report, we will actually hear about its findings. Welcome up, Srirak Plivat, Executive Director of Freemuse. Welcome up.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and presenting the report. This is one of the exciting time of the year for all the work that we spend during the time. But let me start first by acknowledging our supporters, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, SIDA. Without this support, we would not be able to be here. And also Fritt Norway, who's been our supporters, as well as our hosts that's agreed to do this joint event in very short notice also. Very, very much appreciated. There's many colleagues who cannot be here with us, who's basically spending incredibly amount of time trying to monitor the world of artistic freedom from Copenhagen, as well as different national offices that we have. We're now living at a particular time where we called a rise of right-wing politics and populism. And this has been setting the scenes of the where we are at the moment. What this report will show basically happened to particular context, and this is a human rights challenge of the 21st century, and we basically will need similar equation to address those particular concerns. Last year we came up with the State of Artistic Freedom report, and we're arguing that now the world is getting into a global culture of silencing others. And there are 4 or 5 features that we highlight. First is happening by multiple players. It's no longer repressive governments that silence artists. It's also West and East and South. It's also not only governments, but also companies, extremists, religious, various bodies, including individual people, including NGOs that's trying to silence artists in the name of particular causes. So it's multiple actors that try to silence others. We also live in the world of extremists, religious interpretations. My version is the correct one and has to be respected so, with little room for interpretation of reality slightly differently. We also operate where social media platforms has taken increasingly stronger parts, and you will see a number of statistics where censorship happening in social media platforms. And also the growth of right wings in America, most recently in Brazil, where far rights run the politics of against others, whether this is immigrants, refugees, or other minorities, identity-based. In Europe, in the last 2 years, right-wing and far-right group has been taking seats increasingly in at least 14 countries. And this is the backdrop of the report that we are now going to be looking at. In this backdrop, Freemuse monitor what happened to artists as well as everyone who have the right to enjoy their rights. We looked at over 1,500 incidents where we actually come to our radar screen through internet, through our contacts in various parts of the world, and we managed to establish 673 cases that we believe to be violation of artistic freedom against international human rights standards. That's where we measure against. You will see that this might be only half of the case we screen, but partly because we did not find enough evidence, even though we know it's likely to be happening, but you cannot provide evidence for sure, so we do not report on those cases. So more than half of them has been let go in this particular case. But the 670 cases that we established that there are actually violations happened was sufficient for us to identify key trends, to look at patterns, to put that in human rights analysis. So we're not basically report bad news or tragedies that happen to artists one after another, but we look at who's accountable, who's the right bearers, duty bearers, and right holders by providing human rights analysis. We look at patterns and trends that we see happening at this particular time, and we try to find policy solutions to many of these. At the same time, we provide support to victims, but not only portray artists as victims, we like to see artists as actors for change also, and that's what we're basically gearing up to it. A major finding of the report is that artistic freedom is guaranteed in international laws, but not quite yet in practice. And the figures, or the summary of this report can be shown. First of all, we've seen the big picture. 4 artists were killed for various reasons in multiple countries. One of the most alarming trends of this year was 60 artists were put in prisons. And there was a significant increase from last year, that's about 50 artists. And these 60 artists, unfortunately, led by Spain, China, Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. And these 4, 5, 6 countries that has consistently prosecute and imprison artists. We also see a category of being detained, threatened harassment, persecuted artists for particular groups, as well as quite alarming figures on prosecuting artists. When we look in terms of art forms, we see music remain the groups that get hit the hardest among other forms of arts, followed by visual arts. And this is a slightly difference between films and visual arts in different years. Films used to be a number 2 in terms of number of cases, but interchangeably, and visual arts tend to be more sensitive when it comes to minorities, women and LGBT, where particular artists, vulnerable groups, were normally silenced because of their visual arts a little bit more. Theatre, literature, and dance has been quite consistent compared to the previous figures, remained at the alarming at various points. To give you one of the face of artists who's being silenced, this is Hassan Khan, who's basically being put in prison for 6 years and 3 months on the charge that she's belonged to a terrorist groups. And as simple as that, she's a singer for traditional Turkish music, classical music. And this basically show a new alarming trends that we have seen, and that is over 40 artists are now affected by government's use of counter-terrorism to silence artists in the first place. And we chose to highlight this particular information partly because of it's been quite an alarming trend where counter-terrorism is supposed to be supporting national security to keep everyone safe. But this safeguards is being used against artists to silence artists on this ground, and that happened in 9 countries. And we strongly believe that at least three of these countries have used it in a very wrongful way. And as a result, 19 artists were imprisoned on counter-terrorism charge, detained and prosecution that's still ongoing. Musicians, again, were affected the most compared to other type of artists through counter-terrorism. But counter-terrorism law is one of a few laws that violates human rights in the first place. And these laws are being used against artists. Some of the most notorious ones that's being used against artists are the Ukraine ones. Basically bans and prohibit artists, especially from Russia, from performing in the countries. Egyptian has a law that resonates and arrests artists on the ground of indecency. Anything that doesn't fit the cultural norms will go under this. Similar to Iran, where there's clauses that prohibit any insult of the sacred or religious interpretation and expression have to follow that particular interpretation by the government and religious bodies. Turkey has a variety of penal codes from insult the presidents, where now 6,000 people are being sued on this ground, especially after the coup. And artists are some of these groups among that's being sued in the name of glorifying terrorism. or insulting the president. Spain certainly has Article 529 that's basically against prosecute artists on the ground of glorifying terrorism and insulting royal families. And as a result, 14 rappers from Spain has been put in prison, and that makes the highest number of artists imprisoned at the present time, and that come before China and Iran. While it is extremely difficult to abolish one bad law or articles, it is become easy for new bad law to be produced. In 1 year, we've noticed 3 countries that come up with illegitimate laws that will restrict freedom of expressions even more. In Cuba, in Indonesia, and Uganda, all now just passed or in the process of passing laws that require artists to register with governments before they can actually put into performances. In Indonesia, when you write a song, you have to present lyrics of your songs to the government before you can actually go to studio and record your songs. In Uzbekistan, music video that you produce have to be screened by the government, whether the music video and the lyrics match each other. And there are cases where it doesn't match, and that's one of extreme case of policing creativities. Looking at where prisons, imprisonment and detention, we've seen that most of these cases, half of them are because artists criticize or opposing government policy. You see 18% here, that's the alarming increase of putting in prison or detention of artists on the ground of being supporting terrorism or counter-terrorism measures. Religious and minority, these figures stay pretty much the same as in the previous years. So the first 2 are the ones for us to keep an eye on. We've seen compare Global South and North every now and then to make sure that we do check the pulse. We've seen when it comes to imprisonment and detention, normally you've seen these figures reflect in the Global South more, and we've seen increasingly in the North, and that's partly because of Spain, Turkey, and Russia that's been imprisoned artists, one of the highest, while China, Egypt, and Iran has been quite consistent in terms of number and the causes that put artists in prison. Cuba remained number 1 in the world in terms of using detention as a way of silence artists. You detain artists, you let them go, you detain them again and let them go again as a way of threatening arts communities. Remain the world number 1 in this category. Looking at music overall, we've seen the top 3 countries that have most number of cases that we document: Nigeria, Russia, and Turkey. Nigeria partly because the bans of particular songs in nationwide radio when the government do not support that particular songs that make the very high figures. In Russia, the president has made it clear that most of the expressions will have to support Russian nationalism, similar way with Turkey, where any opposing expressions will be silenced. And 36 musicians are imprisoned in 8 countries. And that's kind of a broad, when you put this in the larger scheme of things, this is growing quite quickly, and also a downward trend. When we look at films, continue to be quite similar compared to previous years. Governments has been accountable for 2/3 of violations of artistic freedom under the films category. There are many cases where movies basically cause stirs and protests, burning cars and all of these things that are happening in various countries, where the majority of this has been quite spread, and including in Nigeria, India, where the Hollywood version of these countries has remained. So we notice 2 attacks per week for any filmmakers, and we've seen quite limited engagement of the filmmakers industry also to protect their own artists and we've been working to encourage many filmmakers groups, including international film festivals, to put together groups that support filmmakers at risk also. When we look at theater arts, similar figures in the way that about 2/3 or 3/4 of the case has been responsible by government themselves. 2 theater artists has been imprisoned, 22 detained, and quite a large number also being prosecuted, and mostly because of their criticized governments. To a small extent would be because of the indecency of the theater arts. When you look at 70 acts, that basically means every week there will be some harassment to theater groups somewhere in the world in 24 countries. Religious grounds has still been a popular one, happening in 28 countries, while freedom of expression under international law make it clear that you cannot restrict artistic freedom on the ground of hurting religious feelings. International human rights experts has made this point very clear in many countries, and yet we'll still see this challenge not being practiced. Film, music, and visual arts are still very silent in the name of hurting religious feelings. And also 10 artists being imprisoned on this ground in Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, these particular 3 countries, while some countries have religious police or religious authority. About 70% of these cases are responsible by the government themselves. Women remain one of the most vulnerable groups of artists as being silenced. We've seen the figures has been quite consistent. Over 60% of silencing of women artists are happening on the ground of indecency, as well as showing parts of the body, nudities, remain one of our main features. While this happened to both men and women artists, it happened to women more. And in the previous report on women and artistic freedom, we established discrimination evidence against women artists in law as well as in practice. Main violators, more than half of this still happen to be by the government. And this is one example. The incidents happening again and again. One of the orchestra group in Iran with very few musicians on the symphony being asked in the last minute by the Iranian government to stop performing or ask the women musicians to not play before going ahead. The conductor refused to ask the 3 women musicians to step down, and the concert was cancelled because there were 3 musicians. We've seen incidents like this happening almost every year, and this particular year, last year, was the Isfahan Symphony Orchestra, which is very well known, and happened in the liberal cities in Iran in a way that's where you can actually perform more. LGBT remained one of our vulnerable artists, and we cross-examined whether in this incident happened in countries with law against homosexuality or without the law. And we do not see any significant difference. The figures show that country without law banning homosexuality, there's even more case. So by not having any law against homosexuality, it doesn't guarantee anything. We certainly haven't done the statistics significance test, but that's partly because of the methodology has been the ground rules creating, so we haven't been able to do that in a systematic way. But the figures show that with or without the law against homosexuality, it doesn't help LGBT artists. We also have seen this happening almost 70% because of the governments also responsible in 16 countries. And music remain one of our hardest groups that's being hit. We are putting more spotlight on LGBT, where Freemuse will produce a global LGBT report on artistic freedom this year. Hopefully we'll be able to launch this report in fall later in this year. Minority, this is one of surprise figures. Last year, we've seen the North and South silencing minority artists happening around about the same. But this year, we've seen increasingly in the North, partly especially in the US, that make the figures going quite high, and Turkey. So this has been one of the major change if the report would highlight that now when it comes to silencing artists with minority background, is happening in the rich country maybe more than in the poor countries, rather than the other way around as we tend to believe. A third of this has been on the ground of racial issues, again, especially in the US side, and alarming figures also when it comes to minority. Minority artists are very vulnerable to being charged on the ground of associate with terrorists. That's another alarming trend that we'll see happening. My last two slides has been for looking at the censorship case. Again, we're looking at North and South to compare. We've seen leading the group has been on the US side, partly because of a continuous support of the leader in the countries against us and them, and division narrative that over a longer period of time, this creates the practice of silencing others, and the legitimacy of silencing has been supported by the leadership. This is also why we've seen increasing number of these figures. I mentioned a bit earlier that we have not set aside the time to discuss a solution. This is basically a whole picture of the problems that we've seen, and things are looking to be getting worse if it's going to get better at all. But that's the pictures of the report. We put recommendations in our report also. We wanted to highlight the importance of bad laws that exist in the first place, and this law being used against artists. We discussed with UN special rapporteurs to address some of these issues at the same time while supporting individual artists with organizations like ICONS and Art and Freemuse that support individual artists. So the importance of supporting individual artists at the same time, address structural changes have to happen at the same time and hand in hand, and not working in parallel. And that's where the nexus has to happen. So that would be one small point, and look forward to the discussions of what we can actually do in a situation like this. Thank you very much. Okay.